الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And Jazakallah khair so much for coming this evening to participate in this talk. The topic for tonight could have gone many ways. So often I'm invited to speak about generally women's rights or what Islam has to say about women in general, what their roles are. And so when this opportunity came up, I thought, well, let's do it a little bit differently, because often we hear talks about what are the rights of women according to Islamic texts, or what are the rights of women according to maybe Western ideas or other ideas. So I wanted to really ask the question, what defines women's rights in the first place? So how do we know, for example, whether something is a right that should be achieved or striven for? How do we categorize, or how do we identify what the situation ought to be, rather than just hearing about things from maybe critics of Islam who say, for example, that women's rights should be such and then imposing it on other communities? And even also to have a better understanding of what Islam explains and prescribes for the criteria of rights in general. So today I want to talk about the process of understanding, first of all, the basis for rights. What is the basis for a right in the first place? And I'm going to talk about this, first of all, from the Western perspective, so that we can understand maybe some of the flaws that exist in that understanding and in that advocacy. So when sometimes we are asked to, as we are pretty much on a daily basis, asked to explain why women's rights are such and such in Islam, we can first of all say, well, why are women's rights or rights in general such and such in Western society? Because we shouldn't always have to be defending our position. Sometimes we should question the person that's asking about our beliefs in the first place. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about the basis for rights. I'm going to talk about some of the absurdities that underlie these principles. And then, and only then, we're going to look at, I think, Islamic rights and what Islam says about what rights are and what constitutes women's rights in the first place. So to begin, the very simple question, what is a right? What is the basis for rights? And in Western and liberal thoughts, or the mostly what persists in the Western world or in liberal democracies around the world, we have different threads. We have different foundations. They all generally come from the same principles, but I'm going to go through a few of the different avenues from which they stem from. The first is the idea of natural rights. The idea that if we look at nature and if we look at how nature works, apparently we can determine what our rights should be. So this is one of the Western ideas, one of the liberal ideas of how to determine what a person's rights should be. So, for example, many Christians would observe nature. They would see what happens in nature, and they would say that basically nature is like revelation for Christians. And so they thought that they could understand the divine will from looking at nature. So they would conclude that because, human beings live, they exist, that they must have a natural right to live. So they also concluded that because human beings seem to have a free will, they can do as they please, that human beings must also have a right to liberty. And they also concluded that because human beings pursue different objects for sustenance or for use, like food or, wood to either eat or to make, tools out of, they therefore presumed that, human beings have a right to pursue the material world. So in other words, life, liberty, and, material things, which they then, the material things they have conflated with happiness. So for them, life, liberty, and happiness are natural rights. But if we look at the natural order of things and the natural world, does the natural world really give you these rights? For example, does a tsunami respect the natural rights of a human being to live, to have liberty and do what he wants and pursue material benefit? No. So nature in that case doesn't really respect or, point to the human right to any of those things. Similarly, if you were stranded on a desert island, would you naturally have a right to live and survive? No, you would be fighting against nature in order to survive and in order to live. And so the idea of nature explaining what our rights are is not a good foundation. And yet they use this to try to say, well, nature is a way to understand what rights should be. And then they also tried to explain that natural tendencies, like a human being's natural tendencies, should dictate what our rights are. So, for example, if you have a tendency to feel hunger or to, then you have a right to food and this kind of thing. But what about tendencies which are bad things, like tendencies to lie or to fight or to attack people? Does these do these things give rise to rights for people to lie and to be violent and attack people? No, it doesn't. Just because they're tendencies of a human being, it doesn't mean that those tendencies give rise to rights for people. They also claim that, we are owed rights just by virtue of being human. So some of the foundations of human rights is that by virtue of being human, you have a right to certain things. But if that's true, then under human rights, for example, if you have a right to freedom and a right to liberty and go about your business, if you commit a crime, suddenly you don't have that right. If you commit a crime, you're still a human. So by virtue of being human, you would still have that right to be free, right? So that doesn't actually happen in the real world. So we know that, therefore, simply being human is not enough to dictate what your rights should be, because we often take away people's rights despite them being human. So for Christians, like in Islam, this is not a very good representation of what Christians' values really are, because like in Islam, we don't really have the right to be free. Essentially, all human beings are the property of the Creator. We are the property of God. So we don't have these freedoms of natural freedoms of life, liberty, and material gain. And yet human rights has tried to take these principles and to instill them into a liberal doctrine that they use today to try to explain and understand rights. And then, so that's natural rights, which the West advocates in some situations. Another branch which leads on from this is what's called utilitarianism. So the idea that rights should be based on establishing the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. But this has, some of the same flaws as the natural rights. So, in other words, it really includes the possibility of breaching rights or committing injustice if it means that the greater number of people are happy. So you can oppress a minority as long as the greater number of people are happy. So this doesn't really work out for anybody either. Not only that, but how can a human being predict what will be conducive to the greater good? How can a human being predict what will cause the greatest happiness for the greatest number? It doesn't make sense. Human beings don't have that foresight or that background or that understanding. So there's lots of, the problems with these is there's lots of injustices that can actually be justified by this obscure appeal to a future greater good. And it can also lead to different conclusions depending on the context. So, for example, under this principle, you could oppress a minority or you could liberate a minority, because the same arguments can be used both ways. There's nothing to say which group of people takes priority. There's nothing to say which group of rights takes priority. It just comes down to the ideas of whoever is making the decisions. And then we come on to modern liberal rights theory, which stems on again from this. So essentially, the definition of modern liberal rights theory, and these are all relevant for us to know because these are often the ideologies which are being held against Islam and compared with Islam and said, well, why doesn't your ideology resemble this? So this one is, the modern theory of liberal rights. And so it's generally the idea that the government, apparently, it expresses the majority's will in a democracy. So apparently, the rights of the majority will be represented by the government, and then rights is what the minorities have against the government. So this is the modern theory of liberal rights. So it's the idea that apparently the vast majority of people will be represented by the government, which is not really true, but this is what the theory says. And then rights are for those people who may be oppressed by the government, but the rights enable them to defend themselves against the majority view. But again, this theory can easily be used to support oppression against minorities. So, for example, in the American South, when they used to have segregation between white people and black people, The white supremacists used arguments such as, they said that they had the right to association. So they would say that they could argue against integration because they would have the right to associate. White people would argue that they would have the right to associate only with white people, and they shouldn't be forced to associate with black people. So they would use the same theory, they would use the same concept of rights to actually perpetuate oppression. So again, this theory doesn't really work in protecting minorities or protecting smaller groups of people. And there is, a number of absurd consequences from these three areas that we've looked at. So just a reminder, we looked at, first of all, natural rights, which is related to human rights discussions. We've looked at the liberal rights theory, and we've looked at utilitarianism. And you'll hear echoes of these generally in discussions, as I said, which, critique other ideologies, particularly Islam. And some of the absurd consequences of these, let's look at those. So first of all, the main absurd consequence is that all of these are man-made. In other words, all of these ways of thinking, oh, this is what rights should be, these are just what people have thunk up. They've just thought about them and thought, well, this is how it should be. They don't have any authority or any reference or any proof to say that this is how it should be. It's all just theories. And even in those theories, they don't really pan out so well. So that's the first obvious shortcoming of these principles. The second is that they all imagine that rights are about the individual. They all imagine that rights are about one person. So when we're talking about rights in these theories, they apparently only relate to what one person deserves or one person, is requiring or should get. But rights in of themselves, inherently, if you think about them, they're actually about relationships between people. Rights are about governing relationships between people. So how then can rights just be about the individual? It's clearly not about the individual. Rights are therefore about relationships between individuals. So that's the second flaw in these ideologies, or the second, absurd consequence. The third is the erroneous idea, which we always hear, that all human beings are equal. So we keep hearing that all human beings are equal, and therefore we should all have equal treatment and equal rights and equal opportunities. But if we think about it, how is anybody equal? How are even two people equal? Every single person has a different level of intellect, a different strength, a different appearance, different skills, different talents, different sizes, different backgrounds, different levels of wealth. So people generally are not equal. So how then are they all going to be given equal rights? And this is often raised in the context of gender. So in the context of rights for men and rights for women, we're often told that men and women are exactly equal, and so they should have, equal rights and equal treatment. However, as I'll just explain later, men and women have equal consideration for rights, but they shouldn't have the same rights because they don't necessarily need the same rights. So for example, I don't need the same rights as, I wear glasses. Somebody else doesn't have the same, a need to wear glasses, or, I don't have a need, alhamdulillah, for like a disabled parking spot. Somebody who is disabled has a right to a disabled parking spot. Very simply, we don't all have the same needs, and therefore we don't all have the same rights. And finally, another absurd consequence, and this one is funny because it almost contradicts the one I've just said. So one of the arguments which I just mentioned is that they claim that all people are equal. But on the other hand, we keep hearing that everybody is unique, everybody is special, everybody is so different. Everybody is, Everybody is just amazing. This is what we keep hearing. Everybody is unique. All their qualities are fantastic. And therefore, people can't have the same rights. All people must have incredibly different rights and have incredibly different circumstances and needs. And, well, that's also not entirely accurate. Some people say that, some people say, for example, it's amazing. Somebody said this to me. No two snowflakes are alike, and similarly, no two people are alike. So how could we have, the same rights or the same needs? But really, snowflakes pretty much are alike. They're all made of ice nuclei, water molecules. They all come down from the sky in certain climatic conditions. They all have generally 6 symmetrical sides, and they all melt under certain conditions. And similarly, although human beings have, different superficial traits and characteristics and personalities, their needs for existence are pretty much the same. So where, men and women are the same, Islam, for example, prescribes the same rights and the same obligations, but where they're different, Islam prescribes different rights. So we neither adhere to the position that all human beings are equal, and we neither adhere to and therefore they all have equal rights, and we neither adhere to the position that everybody is so different that you couldn't possibly have the same, have like a formula to deal with the situation. And as an example of some of these absurdities, I don't know if anybody heard about the Tunisian protester called Amina Tyler, who maybe, I think it's been, time goes so fast, maybe it's been 2 years now, but recently, or whenever it was, she protested, she made this very vulgar protest in which she protested nude, and she had written on her body, "My body is mine and not the source of anyone's honor." And she was obviously, from a Muslim family, and she was trying to assert her autonomy. And she was supported by feminists because she was upholding, the one of the underlying fundamental values of feminism, which is the idea of ownership over one's body. And therefore, because you own your own body, you have the right to decide what you do. And everybody has, it goes back to that idea of, individual rights, and everybody can decide what they themselves want to do. But, the reality is, how exactly do we own our own bodies, either men or women? If ownership is control, then neither men or women own their own bodies. Did we give birth to ourselves? Can we will against aging or sickness? No, we can't. If ownership is maintenance, can we survive without even depending on other people? No, we can't. Can we survive without even depending on the environment for our continued existence? No, we can't. So how exactly do we own our own bodies? How exactly do we have that autonomy over our own bodies? Of course, Islam recognizes that we don't have that complete autonomy over our bodies, and therefore we don't have complete autonomy to decide what we do with them. We have duties and obligations because our bodies are considered like an amana, like something that is entrusted to us by the Creator, and therefore the body is like a vessel for which we have rights and duties, not only towards ourselves, but towards other people with that. So the idea that, we own our own selves and we can do what we want and we decide what our rights are because, we own ourselves, doesn't really hold any water, particularly when you compare it with Islamic ideology. Now, those are some of the problems with these, with the Western ideas or the liberal ideas of rights and the basis for rights. Now, the main problem with all of these theories is that none of them can indicate or describe what our rights ought to be. So none of them can actually say, okay, so based on my theory, here's what things should look like. Here's how, here's what your rights should be and here's what your rights should be. They can't actually explain that. So, how exactly do they decide what somebody else's rights should be? Are we supposed to be in competition with each other, or are we supposed to be cooperating with each other? These rights don't deal with the questions of, for example, what is justice? Because obviously rights are to facilitate justice, to produce a just environment. Is justice the same as equality? As we've already talked about in the natural world, nobody is equal. Is justice about simply giving people equal opportunities and rights? Now, one of the famous or the very prominent theorists of liberalism and the concept of liberal rights, he even admits that his theory has to be abstract. He says it has to be abstract if it has to be neutral on paper. So when you read about it theoretically, they don't want it to be to sound like it's oppressing any particular group, and therefore it has to be neutral. But therefore, the theory that doesn't actually specify what the rights should be, or where the line should be drawn between the rights of the individual and the rights of the majority of the group. And he said that the institution of rights requires an act of faith on the part of minorities. So under the liberal concept of rights, the minority simply has to trust that the majority will do what's right for them. can a minority really trust a majority to do what's right for them? So he said, basically the gist of it was, although there's some kind of promise of consideration towards minorities, they just have to rely on the majority to guarantee them their rights. So essentially, under liberalism, rights only exist when human beings say they exist. They don't exist otherwise under these schools of thought. It requires basically an imaginary belief. You have to rely on somebody, believing in it, just like Monopoly money. You're playing a game, everyone pretends that the money is real, and that's basically what it is like. So is that how we're going to determine our rights? Are we going to subscribe to these kinds of schools of thought which rely on your rights being defined by, first of all, particular people, just basically out of their own imaginations, people's convenient politics, or, somebody's fanciful, calculations as to what is the greatest happiness for the greatest number? They all seem very arbitrary. They all seem very and very dangerous ways of managing and governing relationships between people. So if we think about it, the only rational source of rights, if it's not determined by nature, if it's not determined by man, it has to be through revelation, because there's no other way. So basically, rights ends up being about what people deserve. So I mentioned earlier the example of if somebody has the freedom to go around and do whatever they want, but then they kill someone, their freedom is taken away, right? So they go to prison or whatever. So rights is generally, and lots of people generally accept this, that rights tends to be about what people deserve. It's not about an innate, like, oh, just because you're human, you have certain rights. And when we look to Islam, the difference is that we don't just look at the material world. So whereas, for example, in these previous theories, they looked at the material world to understand what a right should be, what was the greatest material benefit, what was the natural world telling them about rights and things. But rights they're not necessarily physical, and Revelation talks about the metaphysical. And when we look at nature, or we look at the natural world, what we do see is that, things exist. And the conclusion from that is that there has to be something outside the material world that caused them to exist. So, and when things exist, it's because they have a purpose. So we know that nature exists because the Creator intended a purpose for it. Similarly, we know that human beings exist because God intended a purpose for our existence. Without purpose, there is no existence. So the Creator, therefore, can be the only arbiter and definer of our purpose and what we should be doing and how we should be treating each other. So nature and looking at the natural world can only take us as far as seeing that we have that there is something that is not in the physical world that intended us to be here, and that there is a purpose. And to know what that purpose is, we have to look at Revelation. And this is the only rational source for how we can understand what our rights and relationships should be. So it's not from looking at nature itself. It's not from looking at man-made ideas, but it has to come from the Creator. And as I mentioned earlier, what applies to men in terms of rights applies to women. So in Islam, men and women, because they are largely the same, their rights and duties are largely the same. So, for example, in the political and spiritual arenas, men and women are pretty much equal. So both men and women politically, for example, have the rights to give a pledge to a leader, or their political views are just as valid. So, for example, there's even accounts where the political views of women were considered to be, if a woman gave refuge to somebody who was considered an enemy of the state had to abide by that because they had to trust her political view on the situation. So politically, because politics is about the intellect, men and women are not considered different in Islam, and so they have the same rights in that regard. Similarly, spiritually, men and women are not considered to be different spiritually. The soul is the same. And so what a woman offers by way of worship and what a man offers by way of worship, as we're told in the Quran, none shall go basically without it being, the due reward. So whatever men and women do, they're equal in the spiritual aspect as well. And where men and women differ, then the rights and duties differ as well. And having different rights is not indicative that somebody is lesser than another. It's just indicative of the particular needs that a particular group of people tends to have. So, for example, where women are different from men, generally in the reproductive sense, then their rights and duties are different. So, for example, because the woman typically, if not always, is the one that bears the children, can't think of any examples where that hasn't been the case, she has certain rights to be provided for, because obviously having that role and responsibility, which, you know, is a huge part of most women's lives, often means that, you know, sometimes, you know, women need that extra, well, they do, they need that somebody to provide so that they can focus on that role, and they don't need to be distracted by having the same obligations as men. If they had the same obligations as men to provide for the family, can you imagine what that would entail? So it would basically be obligatory, if all things were equal, for women to not only have and raise children, but to also go out to work. And the ideal scenario for you know, in Islam is that women, whilst they can do that, if they really want to, it's not an obligation. Because if you make it an obligation, you make it impossible. But it's not. The freedom is there to do that, but you don't have to. So you can see that now, like, this is why we start to see that the rights and duties are slightly different in Islam. So it's not just we're all human beings, so we all have the same rights. We're all human beings, so we all have the same duties. It's not that flat. It's not that ignorant of the different natures of different people. And similarly, in the social and that's slightly the economic sphere. So we're talking about women don't have to go out and earn. However, if they do, they get to keep whatever they earn, and men generally keep whatever they earn except for what they have to provide for their families. Similarly, you know, on the social level, men and women have different obligations. You know, just in the style of obligations when it comes to, for example, observing modesty and things like that. So both men and women have a level of hijab, but it's just manifested differently. So for men, it's from the navel to the knee and lowering the gaze. And for women, it's everything but the face and hands and lowering the gaze. So this is because, again, men and women are slightly different. So women tend to be the more aesthetic of creatures, like in all of nature. You always have the one which is, you know, in birds sometimes, strangely, it's the male, which is often more ornate and more, you know, attractive. In humans, it tends to be the other way around. So they have different obligations and different duties, you know, in this sphere. So again, because of the difference, it's slightly different. And it's not just between men and women, you know, generally different contributions to society are expected from people who have different capabilities. So, for example, those who are more wealthy in society will have a greater obligation to provide for those who don't have so much. Those who are more intelligent than others will, or are more skilled in certain things, are obliged to use those skills to benefit others. And similarly, you know, any arena where somebody is stronger than another, it's considered a duty to discharge that by way of assisting and helping other people around you and doing good with those things. So it's not just a difference between men and women, it's a difference generally between all groups of society. And again, whoever is weaker in something is not necessarily lesser. And I'm going to borrow an analogy from another writer called Wahiduddin Khan, and he said that basically just because the eyes are soft and delicate and the nails are hard and strong, it doesn't make the eyes less valuable than the nails. In fact, you would often maybe think it was the other way around, but, you know, similarly, just because one person is weaker at something, it doesn't make them lesser than the person who is stronger at that. And the reason I mention that is because often people think that, you know, women are the weaker of the genders, and in some areas men are weaker, and in some areas women are weaker. It's not just like this black and white boxes. So in both cases, the weaker is not necessarily, you know, lesser than the other. And there's three kind of analogies that I want to use to explain how Islam views the administering of rights and duties. So we talked about the absurdities of the basis or the foundations of rights in liberal thought. And then we talked about the foundation of rights in Islamic thought. I've talked about a few examples of the differences between rights for men and women in Islam and why those differences exist, very briefly. And now I want to talk about how those are supposed to be administered. So how are these rights, which we've talked about, supposed to be administered so that we know that justice is established by using those rights? Now, the first, I'm going to borrow a story which is not from like any kind of like Islamic book. It's been cited in like old Chinese like myths and also like been used by some Jewish rabbis in different ways. So, but it's a really nice analogy. So basically, there's a story about a man and he's shown a picture of hell. He's shown a picture of hell. And hell is basically a long table. There's people sitting on one side with bowls of food in front of them. And there's people sitting on the other side with bowls of food in front of them as well. And they all are sitting there and they're not eating. And they can't. You can see them struggling. And the reason they're struggling is because their elbows don't bend. So the food is right here and they can't reach it because their elbows don't bend. And so they can't eat. So this is the picture of hell. And then he's shown a picture of heaven. And in the picture of heaven, people are eating. And they're eating because they're feeding each other. So they can reach across the table and feed the person in front of them. And similarly, this is how Islam looks at rights and duties amongst men and women and amongst human beings. It's not all about what you can do for yourself. Rights are generally administered and only ensured because somebody else is assisting in fulfilling those. And this is the Islamic idea of what rights really are. It's not this selfish view that it's all about me and it's about my rights, which we keep hearing these days, you know. What are you going to do for your rights? Stand up for your rights and my rights and this kind of thing. It's not that selfish. Another example is it's said that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that he gave an analogy of the example of the people who abide by God's order and the people who don't abide by God's order. And it's really, really apt. Like you can look at it in so many ways and it just makes sense. So it was said that the example of the person abiding by God's order and restrictions compared with the one who violates them is like the following. And he said it's like the example of people who drew lots on their seats for a boat. So basically at random, people chose whether they were going to be on the upper deck of the boat or the lower deck of the boat. So for example, in society, like I was mentioning earlier, some people are considered on the upper deck, for example, if they're more wealthy or more intelligent or they have certain advantages or privileges. And some of them drew the shorter lots and ended up on the lower deck in some areas. And so the narration goes on, some of them got seats in the upper part and others in the lower. And when the ones in the lower part needed water, they had to go up to bring water. They had to go up to the people on the upper deck to bring water, because from the lower deck you can't. You're basically submerged. The bottom part of the boat is submerged. And so they would go up to bring water, and that troubled the upper deck passengers. The narration goes on. When the latter needed water, they had to go up to bring water, and that troubled the people on the upper deck. So they said, i.e. the people on the lower deck, they said, let's make a hole in the bottom of the ship so that we can get water and that won't trouble the people on the top. So they thought, okay, we'll just get our own rights, we'll get our own water, we'll just make a hole in the bottom, easy. We don't have to bother the people upstairs. We'll have our water, job done. But the obvious reality is, as the narration goes on, if the people in the upper part allowed the lower deck passengers to do that, then all of the people of the ship would be destroyed because the whole ship would go down. But if they had stopped them, then both parties would be safe. And the reason this analogy is really meaningful is because these days, when a group of society is finding that their rights are not being delivered, they're not being administered. So, for example, there are many situations in which, women are finding that their rights are not being guaranteed. There are some situations in, generally men and women are finding that the state is not guaranteeing their rights, or the poor people are finding that the rich people are not assisting them in the way that they should. Sometimes the oppressed people are then turning away to other ideologies, looking to make a hole in the boat. They're turning away to other means that it's not going to secure their rights, but it's rather going to take everybody down with them. And the reality is that they should be insisting on their rights from the people on the upper deck, even if they think that it's going to bother them, because it's the duty of the people on the upper deck to provide those rights. So, for example, when the police have weapons and guns and things, it's not considered, too much to ask them to protect you. That's why they have them. Similarly, when people have advantages in society, they have them so that they can assist the others. And that's the whole point of them. So when Islam places responsibility on one group of society to care and protect for another group of society, it comes with a responsibility. Essentially, it's a duty. It's not just a privilege. And that in of itself is how Islam preserves equality and rights between men and women. So sometimes when we talk about, as I was mentioning, women's rights, and, there are many scenarios in the Muslim world where we see that those rights are really not being administered, they're not being looked at, they're not being respected. And similarly, it's not just women's rights, but, men and women in many Muslim countries are generally being oppressed by, the rulers or the type of governing or the states. And so in those ways, they're also being, oppressed on the lower deck, being ignored. So as we can see, the Islamic view of rights is very different from the liberal view of rights. First of all, it's not man-made. It comes from we understand our rights by looking at what the Creator has said about it. And secondly, it's not just about what you can do for yourself. It's not about minorities only dealing with themselves. It's not about, people only looking at their own rights. It's actually about how we're supposed to assist each other in making sure that everybody gets what they deserve. Because essentially that's what rights are. As I mentioned earlier, rights are about what people deserve and what they need to get. So essentially, we looked at, first of all, the basis of liberal rights in the West. Then we looked at the absurdities of those bases. And then we looked at the Islamic understanding of those, and then some of how they influence men and women's rights in Islam. And so I think that generally concludes what I would like to say about this topic this evening. But inshallah, open to question and answers if anybody has any.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do you have anyone from the sister side? Okay, I'll start. Where do we, obviously within the Islamic paradigm, a lot of the rights and responsibilities are defined based on gender, not necessarily based on skill set or ability. Although those skill sets or ability are sometimes innate, sometimes not. Where you have a situation, for example, where a man is perhaps disabled or unable to care for somebody else or unable to provide for someone else, but a woman is wealthy and able to, a multi-billionaire, for example, for argument's sake.
Okay.
In a situation like that, Islam still requires the provision of the man for the woman, and all that marriage, in its principal sense, from an obligatory perspective, can't take place. You can't have an extra contract which negates the very nature of a marriage, which requires the man to provide for the woman. So, in many of the situations that have been mentioned, whether it's to do with the man providing for the woman, whether it's to do with leadership of a society, which some people would argue either way, it seems to be that it's the skill set that is the issue, not the innate nature of it. So I'm saying that although a woman, for example, will give birth, it may be that the man may be better at looking after the kid. There are some men who are very good at looking after the kids, and women who are very much better outside. In that situation, perhaps the obligation should be the other way around. How do we ensure that Islam doesn't impose a condition that is not applicable to all and doesn't take care of the minority?
Okay, that's a good question. So essentially, essentially, if I understand, the question is, whilst Islam prescribes a rule, for example, that the man should be obliged to provide for the woman, what about in the scenario where it's just not possible? And is Islam then going to end up penalizing or forcing those people into a difficult position because it's made those obligations? Now, when Islam provides the rights and duties for men and women in those areas, as I mentioned, where they differ, it tends to be on what tends to be the case. So most women will tend to have children. Most men will tend to be the breadwinners. But that's not always the case. Islam doesn't say in those scenarios, even if the man is disabled, he has to provide for his family. This is basically would be an injustice and an oppression. In those scenarios, the situations kind of take care of themselves. So Islam is presenting the default position so that people don't have to quibble about it in the first place. So the default position would be generally that men will provide for women and generally women will raise the children. However, it's not saying that you must do it this way at all costs, even if you can't, even if you're disabled. No, it's saying that this is the general rule and there's always going to be exceptions, and generally they tend to resolve themselves. So sometimes there'll be a relationship in which the woman, she doesn't have to be a multi-billionaire, and the man doesn't have to be disabled, but she might just be the one that is the go-getter, just generally more career-minded and more ambitious, and the man might naturally be more kind of a different disposition where he's kind of happy to take the other role. And in that scenario, there's nothing to stop them from kind of reversing roles, because in the working world, Islamically, there's nothing to prohibit a woman from working. There's nothing to prohibit a man from looking after and raising his children. If they want to, have it in writing somewhere, like in a contract, then they can always have that provision in their marriage contract, because in the marriage contract, you can generally have whatever provisions you want to have. It's generally a contract that you negotiate in that way. So whilst Islam talks about the general rule, it doesn't ignore or doesn't try to punish people who don't fall into that category. So, for example, even if we look at the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his marriage to Khadija radiallahu anha, she was the main breadwinner. It said at least at some point she was the main breadwinner, and there was nothing to say, oh, she had to stop and she had to go in the house, and no, it was nothing like that. So generally, whilst Islam talks about the general rules and the general tendencies, and it tries to provide ruling for that, so there's no confusion amongst most people. There's no arguing about who owes who what. There's like a general provision. This is how the default position should be. But if you don't fit into this mold and you find a way to make it work otherwise, then there's nothing to stop them from doing that.
Any questions from the sister's side?
Sort of as a follow-up question to what was just asked, how is, in your explanation, how would that be any different than what you mentioned in the liberal thought of minorities being dependent on the majority for getting their rights? In the explanation you're giving, the default position sort of is that majority position, right? And the people who don't fit that default is sort of a minority position. And how is it sort of working itself out any different than minorities dependent on the majority?
So the question is, how is that different from the kind of liberal idea of the minorities being in a maybe a less advantaged position to the majority? And the difference is that in the liberal conception, they've invented what the majority should be in the first place. So they've invented what the general rule should be in the first place. And that may not necessarily reflect what is right or what is appropriate for human society. The Islamic position, on the other hand, is basically from the Creator himself saying that this is what is appropriate for the majority. And then the minorities, are kind of managed accordingly. So the fundamental difference is that it's not man-made. And so, for example, as I was mentioning the example of, the American South, the majority position would have been segregation between blacks and whites. The majority position would have been the oppression of blacks. That's something they've just made up. They've just made it up for themselves, and it's an oppressive situation. Islam is obviously very different because it's not something that people just made up, and therefore it's not. It won't cause an injustice in of itself because it's from the Creator himself. So that's the fundamental difference.
Sister side?
Thank you for that. I have a question for you. What's your take on the current, you would say, the modern day life, which is, the rat race, women going out to work, getting an education, and then eventually having to come across making decisions about how they negotiate this work-life balance. And it's such a modern dilemma for so many women and men and many relationships. So what's your take on that?
It's obviously a very relevant question because the current kind of economic climate and the current economic system effectively forces people to make very difficult decisions about work-life balance, which we maybe have not seen, to such an extent before. So if we look at the history of Islam, if we look at Islamic history, we see that this dilemma has never really posed itself before. So even at the time of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as I mentioned, women worked. It wasn't a big deal. Women worked. They dedicated time to home life as well. And the reason for that is because work didn't always necessitate women being out of the house. It didn't always necessitate people to choose whether they're going to be able to give their due obligations at home or whether they're going to be completely remote in an office 9 to 5 as we are now. So it was a different scenario. Similarly, for example, if during the Ottoman Caliphate, many women worked. They worked from often the workplaces were established in the home. So, for example, they had women actually monopolized a flourishing rug making industry, and they worked from home. They had the factories as inbuilt part of very close to their homes. They would work and not have the risk of neglecting their family life and their obligations in that sense. And when the kind of industrial revolution happened, it forced women to choose between home and factory, between home and office, because what that industrial revolution effectively did was that it moved all ways of earning, or most ways of earning and getting an income and working out from the home. It separated them, and more and more, increasingly, such that these days we have to spend almost an hour commuting just to get to work. You're totally cut off from your home life. And so effectively, the current economic system forces you to make that difficult choice between staying home and working, unless you can find a way to work from home, but it's not really always that feasible. So the modern day life rat race, it's going to end up being essentially people having to make those very difficult choices where they have to either choose to balance things. And it's not easy. Like, for example, apparently women are becoming more and more depressed because they're effectively having to do everything because they decided they wanted to do everything. So women go to work or go to university, then they come home, they look after their families. It's also difficult for men. For example, these days, many households cannot get by on just one income anymore, and the reason for that is because the economic system has been persuaded so much to get women into work that now every household relies on two people working. And this is actually almost made as a criticism of some of the achievements of feminists, because effectively what they achieved was the fact that now women end up having to work in order to provide for their families as well as men. And so from a survival perspective, it's either, you can scale back and have maybe not as much as you wanted and still just have one person earning, or, you can both kind of be in that position. But I think Muslims need to remember also that because in this climate, it's not, or just generally, it's not an obligation on women to earn. There can be the scenario in which, men are the only earners and women dedicate their time to raising maybe, a better future, as in the better next generation, so that these problems can be alleviated at the source, so that, Muslims can have societies in the Muslim world where the economic system is conducive to people who want to work and for people who want to, raise a family, and doesn't force them to make these decisions. So unfortunately, it is a really difficult situation. And for many who have now, it's considered a luxury to be able to stay home and not go to work. It's considered a luxury now. Whereas maybe 20 years ago, feminists would have considered it an oppression that women have to stay home. But now it's considered like, if you get to stay home, it's like that's kind of cool. You're in a good place. But just generally, I think it's a matter of negotiating with your families. What the expectations are, so that at least everybody knows what's going on, and that obviously it depends. Different people have different expectations in this situation. So I'm sorry if that's not entirely clear cut, but it's a difficult scenario. But the thing to remember is that in Islamic history, it has never been like this. And the one thing that's missing, for many Muslims today, is the infrastructure that supports them to have, to have the freedom to make that decision. And we just don't have that right now. I hope that answers your question a little bit.
I mean, I also wanted to mention that it's almost like a power play, isn't it? Because rights are power, and it's a political system. I hate to put it that way, but at the end of the day, when you look at it as a whole system, rights give you power. Rights give you the power to, in some ways, dominate. It's arguable, but with that comes its challenges, and you can tell even in the home. I think a lot of women, in trying to balance it, are finding it almost impossible, because now they've got this added responsibility of working. But that doesn't mean that when they come home, they don't have to do housework,
everything else. Yeah. Just on rights, I think it's a tendency of we're always told that rights are power, and power is good, and we should be empowered, and we should try to get more power, and so power will apparently make our lives better. But as I mentioned earlier, rights are really not about power. Rights actually give you an obligation. So a right is effectively, or even power, is a duty. It's a burden that you have to discharge. So we always take a different view on it. So when they have the, for example, city slickers or workers in the city, you often see it's very a very kind of aggressive and hostile environment. Even, the women embody this kind of very aggressive attitude in the workplace. And that comes from the idea that apparently, it's empowering to work. And work is really just an obligation. You work to live. It's not really something that, empowers people. It's not something that you should be, I'm working, I'm powerful. No, you're working because you have to. It's not really a sign of power. It's a sign of need, really. So
I think we'll have to end there because of Salah time.
Okay.
And hopefully, if it's okay, if you're still around for a bit afterwards, people can still ask questions.
Yeah, no
later
problem.
on.
Yeah, inshallah.
Thank you very much. Salawat.